Welcome and thank you for joining us for this roundtable discussion on refugee student issues. My name is Dr. Maede Abutalebi Karkebandi from Swinburne University. I'm joined by my colleagues from Foundation House, Schools and University of Melbourne, whom I introduce in just a minute. First, I'd like to acknowledge that this talk is originating from the traditional lands of Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nation. We would like to pay our respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. Also, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the ongoing situation in Afghanistan and the fear of these tragic events that are causing stress for many in our community. Our research partners at Foundation House recently ran a webinar on this fast-moving situation and its impact on Melbourne community. And I would like to encourage you to watch this webinar. We share the link in the chat in a second. Before I go further, I hand over to my colleague, Dr. Colin Gallagher from University of Melbourne, to give you a bit of background on the bigger research project that this webinar is part of, and then I'll introduce the panel. Colin, over to you.
Thanks, Maida. Hi, everyone. My name is Colin, and as Maida said, I'm part of the research group here on the project. Just a bit of context for what we're doing. Our talk today is part of a larger project known as the Networked Teacher Project. Excuse me with the slides for just a moment. The Network Teacher Project is a study focused on how teacher social connections can be used to understand and even improve mental well-being, with a focus on refugee background student issues, but also professional social networks, burnout and stress, and collaboration and engagement. In particular, we'd like to give a special thanks to Teachers Health Foundation for supporting the project as a whole and this webinar in particular. It's quite by accident that this project has actually occurred among one of the biggest disruptions to teaching and learning in Australia, and living memory of probably most of those present today. So we'd like to recognize the impact that this disruption has had on teachers, on students, and on families, and their resilience and professionalism in the face of these challenges. So today we're joined by a panel of researchers and practitioners who bring a great deal of experience in the areas of refugee resettlement and school well-being to talk about commonly faced issues, commonly overlooked issues, and what might be barriers to addressing these challenges more effectively. However, before Maida introduces the panelists individually, I would like to give a plug here, let you know that this talk also happens to happening alongside or in advance of the launch of an online platform we're putting together and that we'll be moderating, intended for sharing information and resources across a range of issues related to today's talk. While aimed especially at teachers in schools with a high proportion of refugee background students, we hope that as it grows, it becomes more relevant to teachers in general, covering practical issues of networking and social support, teaching to students from non-English language backgrounds, professional development and workplace learning, as well as school climate. So if you're interested in taking a part, please get in touch with us to express your interest in participating. We'll remind you at the end of today's webinar, as well as in a follow-up email with today's recording. So I'll put it back to Maida now to introduce our panel.
Thank you so much, Colin. I would like to introduce our panel members. Today we are joined by Dr. Karen Block. Dr. Block is the Associate Director of Child and Community Wellbeing Program in the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health. Among her roles, she's the academic convener of PhD program in migration, stateless and refugee studies. Dr. Block is the national leader in the area of the migration studies with reference to health inequalities, integration, inclusion, and social cohesion. Next, we have Farnaz Shahimi. Farnaz is a PhD student at the Child and Community Wellbeing Unit in Melbourne School of Population and Global Health. She has a background in clinical psychology and has worked as a counselor for the United Nations High Commissioners for the Refugee, UNHCR, in Iran. Her research addressed resilience and identity among children with refugee backgrounds. Also, we have Janet Hattis from Foundation House. She's a counselor advocate at Foundation House, and she's currently working in the education and early years team, providing consultation and workshop focused on the refugee experiences and trauma-informed practice for staff within the education system. And finally, we are joined by Eva Merer. She's a well-being coordinator in a number of schools across Melbourne. This provides her with wealth of experience working with teachers of refugee students. Today, in reference to the format, we start with a discussion with the panel members. And then we have a Q&A function in the app that you could ask questions or post comments, and we would answer as we discuss if that's related to the question and if you need clarification. Some more general question, we leave it to the end. We leave 10-15 minutes for that. Next slide. So we have few discussion points today, and it's all from the data that we have gathered from few schools across Melbourne. And we would like to discuss what are the biggest issues facing teachers and students, what are the issues that has been overlooked, what are the barriers and constraints in dealing with the issues, and how these issues and challenges impact teachers' well-being. What are the suggestions and recommendations? So let's begin this discussion. First, I want to talk about the first issue that it came up in our survey, and it was needing to teach a wide range of language abilities. Karen, this question is toward Karen and Janet, but any other of panel members, I'm happy for them to join as well. One fundamental issue, which is a basic one, needing to teach wide range of language abilities. What do you see as the biggest challenge in this area? And if you could give some perspective on that.
Thanks, Maida, and thank you for the introduction. So I will just first start with a disclaimer. I'm not a teacher, so I'm not coming at this from a kind of teaching English pedagogy. But I have done a lot of research in schools with students from refugee backgrounds, and I guess a lot of the focus of my research has been on the social aspects of their lives, and particularly on social capital. So I guess I'd start from saying that, yeah, obviously one of the first concerns is there's a sense of urgency around needing to teach students sufficient English for them to engage in education, but I think quite often what we can see is a real focus on what students don't have, so not having enough English, for example. And we have a tendency probably to sometimes not attend enough to what strengths they do have, in particular a lot of language strengths. So many of our students from refugee backgrounds will speak many languages. English may be one of them or may not be one of them, but they will have they often come into the classroom with a wealth of other language skills. And I think it's really, and also other skills all over the place. So, you know, they might have interests and skills in music or sport or art or, you know, or manner of things. And it's really important to give students that opportunity to really show their strengths and really appreciate their strengths, and not just what they don't have, you know, which might be English. I guess the other thing to really focus on is that we know many students from refugee backgrounds will have had a severely interrupted education before coming to Australia. So some will have had no formal education at all, but there's a huge range. Some will be highly educated, and so it's really important that we recognise that range is enormous, and what the specific difficulties are for students who haven't had much formal education before. And really haven't had the opportunity to learn how to learn in a classroom. And I think Janet will speak a little bit more about that as well. But as I said, and I'll just bring up one more point before handing on, I guess a lot of the research that I did really pointed to the importance of social connections. So one thing that, as well as education being disrupted, when people move to a new country, their social networks are disrupted. And that has devastating emotional consequences for people, but it also, the need to develop new networks is really fundamental to also learning English, for example. So opportunities to engage in things outside the classroom, again, such as sport, other types of leisure, and opportunities to actually bring students together in meaningful ways with other young people who perhaps have been in Australia for longer. These are really important for young people to not only to settle, but also to be able to learn English in those more informal settings. If we think about it, you know, the time that they spend learning in the classroom is actually only a really small, it's quite a few hours a week, but it's only a small part of their lives. They may not be speaking English at home, quite often not. And so they really need those other links and those other opportunities to develop networks, both for wellbeing, but also for their learning. And I'll stop there. I'm really keen to hear people's questions at any point, and I'd also like to hand over to Janet, who I know is going to speak a little bit more specifically about teaching in this circumstance.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, I'm going to build on what Karen just mentioned, because I'm not a teacher either, but a lot of my colleagues are in the education early years team, and I'd say that I'm preaching to those who already know about the high impact teaching strategies. I'd say that most of you teachers are already using these strategies in your planning of lessons. And why I'm bringing this up is because Foundation House has been able to link the HITS strategies, as you call it, to our trauma recovery goals. And they are the goals that are looking at creating safety and control, connections and belonging, as Karen mentioned, meaning, identity and justice, and putting forth their dignity and value back into their lives after being traumatised or degraded or dehumanised, as we can say, for many of our colleagues, our clients. So when you're using the HITS with intention to support student learning, but also focusing on the recovery from trauma, if you're using them intently, you can actually support that recovery. So, for example, Karen mentioned, the social networks that they've lost. So if you say use, and I'm looking down at a piece of paper because we actually have a spread of all the 10 important HITs, and the 5th HIT is strategies, collaborative learning. So by putting in meaningful strategies around collaborative learning, you can also set up connections and a sense of belonging with other students in the classroom. That's one way of dealing with issues around the networks and helping them create networks again. You know, looking at, strategy of structured lessons, providing predictable lessons, and provides a safe classroom and an environment that builds on that trust. So students, feel safe in order to give something a go. Also, your HIT strategy, I think it's number 3, explicit teaching, and number 4, worked examples. They're explicitly negotiating new language. So not only for refugee students, but for all your students, new language with new concepts is important to understand. And so when you put these strategies in place and think about them in a trauma recovery model, also, it will help all of your students, not just refugee students. So by having worked examples. It gives, students from refugee backgrounds who are trying to find their way into maybe a new classroom experience, or, learning new language, with opportunities to see how they can do the exercise, the activity that you want them to do, and it gives them an opportunity to feel like they've got, they don't have to be ashamed of not understanding, and gives them a sense of control and a sense of safety so that they can do their work. And also by giving explicit examples, make them meaningful, give them examples that mean something to them so that they can pick up those skills much easier. So there are a few things, but there are 10 strategies, and it's important to look at how those strategies fit in with recovery. Now, we do training around that, so if anyone needs the training, please let us know. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet and Karen. It's very interesting. And please ask your question in the Q&A function about any of these issues that have been discussed. So moving to the next issue, which is more practical, is a student access to the digital access to technology and digital learning resources, which was very prominent when the COVID hit and the last year, and the schools have to go online, and it's less it become less the issue, practical issues, but there are some other challenges for the refugee students and their families. Farnos, can you talk about that based on your experience? How this impact families of refugee students?
Thank you very much for having me. So hello, everyone. Yeah, mainly my background is working actually with families and children with refugee background. So I mostly have their perspective and their experiences with me, especially here after resettlement. I think it's totally different because mainly the whole context has been different from the context that they are coming from. So accessing to the technology is coming maybe with another challenges that parents are experiencing and families are experiencing, which I'm actually going to explain a little bit about those challenges, and then explain a little bit about how actually barriers to access the technology and can actually also be on top of the other challenges. So as you meant, as Janet and Karen also mentioned, this is very important to understand the challenges first, and then try to actually reflect on the solutions. So many teachers might be aware, definitely with their extensive experiences that they have, they might be aware of these barriers, but I'm trying to reflect on the parents' perspectives. So as it was mentioned, parents from refugee background have been suffering from traumatic experiences for years. They might have inherited the transgenerational traumas from their own parents while suffering from their own firsthand experience of trauma. So they experience profound grief associated with losing both tangible possessions like homes, livelihood, and also intangible ones, including culture, social network, as Karen mentioned, and also self-worth. As Janet mentioned, as dignity. So as an example, we are all aware of the horrifying condition right now in Afghanistan, and we can see the impact of re-experiencing traumas among the Afghan community. Even those children who arrived here in their earlier childhood impacted directly by the severe distress their family are experiencing here and overseas in Afghanistan. This is actually a proof that some of the traumas won't be over by resettlement, and there are some ongoing experiences of trauma over years. barrier for both families and children, which impacts actually the mental health and psychosocial well-being. So we sometimes might need to focus more on this aspect, that many of these parents spend most of their lives on survival mode, like just to save their children's lives. So it is very common that many start showing distress and mental health breakdowns, sometimes even years after resettlement. So there are several issues actually like that might contribute to this issue, which education, language barrier, and financial hardship perhaps like contribute to the challenges that parents and families from refugee background are experiencing in accessing technology, especially during like COVID. We're all aware that some parents from refugee background feel unable to assist their children due to language barrier. We are aware that they have insufficient actually financial support to support their children, and we are aware that sometimes they do not have enough time actually like to support, because some parents need to work, both parents need to work, and they are not actually feel supported financially sometimes like to provide technologies. So it is really important like for school staff maybe like to consider this issue as an issue which is like extra, and also like many of them, it was like, I think it was in April that a report was published that the access of migrant and refugee families to technology is below the national average. So this is actually like something which is like put many of families from refugee background in a very vulnerable position to support their children. The lack of basic access, especially like to computers and reliable internet service. So I hope that actually like I can address some of the other family issues like a little bit later in other topics that we're covering. Thank you.
I can jump in here in a moment. I just had an insightful question from Tegan McKee. How can we help to engage families? I see our students. Tegan says, I see our students making connections to the school, but once at home, those connections aren't able to be fostered. We'd like to be able to foster community connections, not just school, and to include families. And this touches on an interesting kind of question and phenomenon of kind of the student or the young person often being a language spokesperson for their family or a broker. So being in between the family whose English language skills might be even less than the students, and the complex role that they take on, not just as a translator. They're not just literally translating one code to another, but it's actually like a social role where they're summarizing and have some agency within the family. So I guess back to Tegan's question, how can we engage families considering this kind of gap that or language barrier in between the family and the school?
I'll jump in first if you like, and I'm sure others will have something to add too. I think it's a really great question because it's so important that schools do try really hard to engage parents. I have come across in the past sometimes ideas that the parents don't really want to engage with the school, and in my experience that's simply not true. They might not feel very comfortable coming to the school, particularly if the only times they've ever been directly contacted by the school is when their child isn't doing well or is in some kind of trouble. So it's really important to actively reach out to parents, and just sending home notices and things like that is probably not going to be enough. You need to actually work to invite parents into the school, provide meaningful ways for them to engage. I've seen some fantastic examples of schools that actually provide, for example, technology classes for mothers or language classes for mothers, because quite often In some of our refugee communities, the mothers won't have any literacy or digital literacy themselves, and that's one of the real barriers for them engaging. Using interpreters when you do reach out and when you hold these sessions is really important. And again, Foundation House does a lot of sessions on working with interpreters. So those, I think it's about that really active outreach and persistence as well. So asking people, more than once, providing multiple opportunities and multiple ways for people to engage in a way that's meaningful for them. And it is so important. And also remembering that culturally, people might have come from cultures where it isn't actually normal to be engaged as a parent in your child's school, where they might come from somewhere where it's like, that's the school's business, school looks after education, my business is in the home. So I guess helping to educate parents that in fact it is welcomed to have their engagement and considered to be an important part of their child's education as well. And that can actually bring huge benefits to the whole family because it helps to connect the parents as well socially and brings them direct benefits as well as benefits for the kids. I'm a bit passionate about that topic, sorry. Others would probably have things to say too.
I agree with everything that Karen said, and would highly, those schools that have multicultural aides or bicultural workers, definitely use them to invite and personally invite, not through, like Karen said, don't send a notice, personally invite them with a phone call to a morning tea or to a meet and greet or an activity. But also, I think, as Karen mentioned, parents are so used to being engaged because their children have done something wrong. And that's, I mean, if I was a parent of a refugee with non-English speaking, I probably would be hesitant to answer a phone call knowing that it is the school that's probably speaking only in English and there to tell me that my child's done something wrong. So with the schools that I work out in the East at the moment, we're highly encouraging schools to reach out when little things are going right for that student. So teachers reach out and let parents know that, little Ali or little John has completed this and how proud they were of that achievement, and not just looking at what goes wrong and what the family needs to step in and support the school with behaviour. If you start connecting on the positives, then I think if issues do arise, then it's easier to have that connection with the family.
Yeah, just a quick comment. That really speaks to what Karen was talking about, a strengths-based approach. If you're kind of highlighting their strengths and talking and sharing that with the family, again, as you say, it's not that the case where every time they pick up the phone, it's necessarily a bad, a bit of bad news.
Colin, are we addressing the next question or should we move to the next issue? There was a question being asked in the Q&A.
Yes, the question comes from Katie McFarland. How do we ask parents and students about sensitive issues and how the family is coping emotionally at the moment? Do we want to answer that now or wait until?
Or maybe it's general. Let's leave it to the end.
Okay.
If that's okay.
Thank you, Katie. We'll address that in just a moment.
Yes. So moving to the next challenge that it came up from our data was how to deal with disruptive student behavior. And Janet, if you could talk about how to use Foundation House trauma framework to respond to the disruptive behavior.
Thanks. I could speak about this for an hour on my own, but I think schools are in a really good place because, I'll keep banging on about our recovery goals, but they actually fit really well in with the school values. And it's really important to look at those recovery goals when trying to address issues within the school. And I think when looking at students' behaviour, you need to actually think about where is that student coming from and what have they experienced and what is happening in their lives at the moment. As was mentioned earlier, with the issues around Afghanistan and even for our Myanmar Burmese communities, the issues that are, and other communities, but those two are in the forefront at the moment. There's so many issues, there's so many things that they're listening to through social media and their families overseas, and their distress within their families are quite heightened. So I think when looking at student disruptive behaviour, I think sometimes as teachers, it's very difficult when you've got lots of disruption happening at different times from different students, and then one massive outburst, and they're usually the ones that attract our attention, are the overt, loud disruptions. You know, thinking about what do we put in place to make that person feel safe, and giving them the time to be able to self-regulate again. There's no point going up to that young person and saying to them, why did you do that? Why did you knock everything off the table, for example? Or why did you start yelling just because they took your pen? There's no point. Cognitively, they won't be able to comprehend or tell you why they did something, because they're biologically gone to a state of either fight, flight or freeze. And that is innate. Because of their experience, it's actually been inbuilt in their reaction to survive. So if their survival mode is to fight, then that's going to be their instant reaction when something goes wrong. You need to provide them with the space and a safe space and some support. And it may not be within your classroom, it might be with another aide or with a coordinator or someone that they can relate to and have a good relationship with, that they can go outside and give them the time to self-regulate and find their, what we call, you know, in your window of tolerance, your window where you can function and you can think straight. And when you do get that young person in that state, give them the opportunity to tell you what happened for them. You know, what it was that, you know, why did they respond the way they do? What was it that, you know, that triggered them? And hear their story, because you've got to understand these families have been, for many, like Afghanistan, Myanmar, and all around the world, for those who are refugees, have experienced humiliation, degradation for generations at times. And they've always had to fight for justice. They've always had to fight to be heard. So you need to give them that opportunity to tell their story and help them work through what their trigger was. Once you've helped them work through what their trigger is, then you can support them in the process of finding ways to work through those before it becomes hardened, those triggers before they become hardened. Work out, how do you know that that's how you're going to respond? Is there something that you feel in your body? And that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen with one incident, but you know, the behavior might happen over and over again, but it takes time to change that behavior. And I think it's really important to have that safe space and the support that they require in order to do that. Now, that's only one example, but you know, we can do a whole session around this for 2 hours. So yeah, that's the beginnings.
Thanks, Janet. I think someone Ian asking for the HEAT document. If you could share it in the chat function would be great. Karen, can I ask you, like, in previous discussion, you had some points talking about how having disrupted education. It's it's related to having behavioral problems at the schools and classroom. Can you talk about that as well?
Yeah, so I think what Janet had to say is really important, and she's covered that really well. Obviously you can spend hours on it. I guess I would just go back briefly to my point that I made earlier about disrupted education and lack of time in the classroom. So I guess Janet was talking about some more obvious examples of disruptive behaviour, but students may also not be behaving as expected or wanted simply because they haven't learned what those, these are things that kids who are born in Australia start from preschool all the way through learning these behaviours. They're not innate behaviours to sit there and in a classroom and respond to the teacher. So I think just bearing that in mind, that these are behaviours that kids need to learn, or young people need to learn, and that we're not born with them. And so someone who hasn't had that time in a classroom may not know it. And I think to also be looking out for not just the young person who's disruptive, but the young person who's very quiet, because they may be completely disengaged and not have any idea what's going on. They might not be causing a problem from a teacher's perspective because they're not disrupting the class, but they may be just as disengaged or more so even than the student who's overtly disruptive. So something that's really important to be thinking about as well.
That's a great point. Thanks for mentioning that. I think that's very important to also look out for quiet students as well. Moving to kind of uneasy and tense relationship between students, such as bullying, exclusion, and racism. Janet, what advice do you give to the schools in relation to these specific issues? You are on mute, Janet.
Thank you, sorry.
No worries.
First of all, I have to say that CMY, Centre for Multicultural Youth, actually do racism workshops for teachers. And if you haven't done it, I highly recommend that you do it, because dealing with racism is not an easy thing to do. It's very challenging, and it's challenging as a teacher. Even when I present, if a racial comment is made while you're presenting, there's times when you think, oh, how do I deal with that in a crowd of 30 people without, making it a big deal or without embarrassing someone. So learning how to deal with a situation is really important as a teacher. And when to, making sure that you do call it out at times, because as I mentioned before, our clients from refugee backgrounds have experienced deprivation and have been, they've had their central core value in human existence ripped apart from regimes. So, that there's been racial discrimination for many of our students and families within their own state regime. So to have another person, when they've settled into a new country, make racial comments, and for teachers to treat them as just bullying or exclusion is not enough. And I'm not saying that it's easy to do. It's a hard thing to do, but one of our research projects that was published in 2019, which was the Student Voice Project, it's called Schools Where You Need to Be Equal and Learn. Basically, students indicated that when teachers actively responded to racism, they felt more supported, they felt more connected, they felt that they were a part of the community and they were respected. And therefore, I think it's really important that you have a policy and process in place that teachers, students and parents understand the process, and that there is an outcome, and the outcome is explained to the victim and to their family. And that it's not just, we will deal with that student and we'll talk to them and that's it. They actually need to know that there is a process and that they know what happened at the end of that process. Yeah, does that sort of answer your question?
Thank you.
An interesting, interesting follow-up. I'll take this opportunity. Nathan Boney, or Boney Nathan, excuse me, does ask, so Janet, you talk about everyone having an awareness of what these policies are. Boney seems to be referencing, what about colleagues in the teaching space? So if one is a teacher, what if one's teaching colleagues, and asks, how do we have conversations with colleagues who do not believe in trauma and think that these kids are just bad kids, quote unquote, and their behavior has nothing to do with trauma?
I think my first step is invite someone from Foundation House to have a secondary consult with a couple of teachers, and come from, the way I would do it is come from where that teacher's at. There's no point preaching, but it's about talking to the teacher about what behaviour is being displayed, asking them open-ended questions around what did you see was the incident? Do you think that was the only response? Did you give the young person an opportunity to tell their side of the story? And get them to really think beyond just they're always disrupting my classroom. But validating that they are disruptive, yeah, and it is difficult to deal with, but let's look at, you know, what is happening, and is there a similar pattern that happens? Because usually if you look at it for a 2-week process and keep a diary, there is some sort of pattern that you can pick up on. Yeah.
Sure. I think because of the time, we need to move on to the next challenge. Moving to hearing student traumatic stories and how to deal with disclosure is it's a nice segue to what we were talking. Eva, we heard a lot from our panelists so far about the challenges that students with refugee background face. What is the impact on staff well-being, and what are the suggestions to how to cope with the challenges?
Yeah, first, thank you for inviting me. As a teacher and a psychotherapist, I always feel very privileged to talk about staff well-being, because that's at the heart of a school, in my opinion, because staff well-being and student well-being is intertwined, and we can't separate that. You're asking about the impact. So we will be impacted by our work, both positively and negatively. Working with challenging students or with students with a refugee background is very rewarding. But on the other hand, it's also very challenging and can be very draining as well because of workload of situations. I come to that in a second. So we need to actively manage the impact, even if we don't feel like it, or we think maybe, oh, I don't need that, because the rewards are there, you know, when you work in a school. But we have to keep in mind that even if the work is satisfying, we have to recharge and refresh ourselves. Otherwise, we can't be at our best level. And also really important is that to keep in mind, we don't have to know everything. There will be situations outside of our expertise or experience, and that's okay. There are lots of experts we can talk to. We can have a secondary consult, like Janet just said. So there are lots of support systems in place we can use, but we have to reach out and manage it actively. When we talk about staff wellbeing, what I would like everyone to keep in mind is we're talking about different levels of staff wellbeing. So there's the individual level where we have to look after our own well-being. That's our responsibility. But there's also a school and leadership level where a lot of things could be put in place for staff well-being, and also on a systemic or on a society-wide level, where you have to create an environment where teachers and school staff feel valued and safe and be in a position where they can play out all their expertise and what they are good at teaching students. So we have to keep that in mind when we talk about staff well-being, that there are different levels where we can address issues. So as I said, working with students with refugee background is very rewarding, but of course, there are some challenges like the trauma, and Janet and I think Karen talked about trauma-informed practice and trauma-informed approach in schools, and that's absolutely crucial for staff well-being as well, because if you create a safe classroom where someone with a trauma background can thrive, that's also an environment where teachers can thrive. So it's really important to keep that in mind, that staff well-being and student well-being are together. If staff is not feeling well, if staff is exhausted and burned out, student well-being will suffer too. So it's really, really important. When I work with teachers, what teachers bring to me in sessions is that they are confronted with, for example, difficult classroom behavior, verbal threats, even violence. And that's not necessarily violence against the teacher, but often student-on-student violence. Teachers might experience feelings of helplessness or anger or fear and when confronted with these challenges. And that's very common. That's not to say they did something wrong, but that's something we have to acknowledge in that work. Another factor is that teachers or staff members are human beings like you and I. That means we have staff members who have their own experience with childhood trauma or with violence or migration. So they are at particular risk of experiencing a stronger impact as well. So two things that I want to talk about, because as all the others, I could talk like the next 3-4 hours about staff well-being, but we have to, condense it to a few talking points. So two aspects of the work is that often teachers experience burnout when they're working in a high impact environment. So what does that mean? It means burnout is a combination of symptoms resulting from a chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. So we feel overworked, exhausted, and because we try to be very diligent, teachers are trying their best to support every individual student coming to webinars like this one after work, to additional research. We overwork and we take on more responsibilities than we can take on us. So we feel depleted, exhausted. But over time, when we don't manage that, when you don't put our own well-being strategies in place, what happens is that this exhaustion gets more and more and more, and we feel an increased distance from our own job, or even negative feelings towards our own profession or career. We can develop sarcasm as a strategy to cope with it. And over time, obviously, our professional productivity, our ability to teach is diminished and reduced as well. Often people feel ashamed when they feel exhausted and overwhelmed, because sometimes it's a sport, who is leaving last from the car park in the school. That's not a healthy way to deal with being overworked, obviously. Or they don't take the exhaustion serious because everyone else is overworked too. So why should I be different? And often, especially with male colleagues, often is self-care is seen as, I'm weak if I need that. But the opposite is obviously true, because if we don't treat our burnout or overworking, then we can develop depression or anxiety. We are distracted, our relationships will suffer. And if we don't have good relationships with our students or with work colleagues, then we are less effective. We can't work with trauma impacted students or families if we can't build good relationships. I think Janet or Karen touched on self-regulation. So if we are burned out, we can't self-regulate ourselves. So if we are not regulated, how can we expect students to be self-regulating? We have to model it for them. So it's really, really important to look after ourselves, because otherwise we can't be effective in the classroom. We can't self-regulate. The second challenge I want to mention, because that's widely overlooked, nobody talks about it in a school setting, is vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. So that's, we can say that's the cost for caring for others. Teachers are very compassionate people. It's a compassionate profession. We empathize with our students. We live with them. And we also witness their trauma by seeing them upset or in pain or angry or fearful. We hear the stories they tell us. We get the background of the family. So we experience the trauma on a secondary level. And that can impact us in a similar way, like if you are impacted by a trauma directly. So we can even develop the same symptoms like someone who experienced a trauma. Our whole worldview can shift. That means we see the world as an unsafe place, out of our control. And as you can imagine, that's a really stressful position to be in. And it's very, very layered. So the question is, are we just destined to have a burnout or vicarious trauma? And the answer is obviously, no, we are not. It's not a given, but we have to actively manage our well-being to counteract what we experience in our work and develop a good resilience. So we have to take good care of ourselves. So everyone heard about, self-care strategies, mindfulness, having a good diet, having a good exercise regime, going for walks during lockdown. All these things are really, really important. Not only to do when shit hits the fan and we're in a crisis, but on a regular basis, every single day. It's like Olympia. Everyone watched Olympia, I'm guessing here, I'm assuming. And we saw our swimmers going from one gold medal to the next one. But when you looked in the background, you had this coach, and it went around the world. The picture when the swimmer won gold, and he was, yeah, and, excited and everything. That means no one wins a gold medal and is a high level athlete without a team around them. Nobody. And the same if you want to be a high level teacher, you have to have a team around you. That means your work colleagues in your department. That means the wider social network as teachers, beyond school borders, but also on a leadership school-wide level, like leadership being your coaches and looking after you and putting things in place like training opportunities and education opportunities to be consistent over the years in the development of your skill sets and practicing it. And the same with self-care. We have to practice every single day. And if it's just 5-10 minutes, everyone has 5-10 minutes every day. And if you do it, on the way to the bathroom, you have 5 minutes to listen to a mindfulness exercise, for example, or do 30 squats after waking up. So there are lots of things you can do before a crisis occurs. So we have to plan ahead. The same on a school-wide level, we have to plan ahead. For example, if you have a certain refugee community in your school, it's a really good decision to put multicultural aides or community liaison officers in place who can support everyone, the students and staff members, in their well-being and be a connector and a network you can fall back on. It's really important to have a warning system for yourself in place. So you know the warning signs when you're getting overworked and overwhelmed. For example, when I go to a coffee shop in not lockdown times and I sit down and I choose the place in the last corner when nobody is talking with me, I know I'm overworked. That's my warning sign if I don't want to talk to anyone. So I know I have to look after myself better. So everyone needs to develop this warning signs as well. Of course, it's really important to make good use of the employee assistance program. That's like the school or the department system, but also school-based staff wellbeing support. Really important debriefing after incidents. So not only support in the classroom, but also after incidents in the classroom or in the yard, that teachers or staff members are supported and have a proper debrief. like you would expect in a health professional environment as well. There's, of course, ongoing education and training is necessary. And last but not least, healthy work relationships. So networks of teachers and staff members are really important to increase your own well-being, but also as a staff group to increase well-being. So school is teamwork and not can't be done by one individual alone, isolated. And when this responsibility is shared, then staff well-being and in my opinion, schools are successful and can sustain the success.
Thank you very much, Eva, for very insightful comments. It does look like we're going to go a little bit long, so before we move on to a bit of Q&A session, I'd just like to thank all the panelists present today for your very insightful contributions. So obviously people will drop off as time commitments take their bite, but just looking through the comment section, there's a very helpful and productive series of comments around kind of the specific strategies we can use to engage students, engage families, but also the importance of well-being and self-care. I guess one question that's come up that maybe Eva will be in a position to answer, I think it came up in the comments, was there's a lot of talk around, you know, bridging a gap, having a conversation when normally we wouldn't, but there's been some questions about when can that be harmful in a trauma circumstance? When are you not supposed to brief or ask about what's going on? So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or guidances around that.
I'm happy to speak to that, Colin.
Yep.
I suppose what we say to teachers in our training is that you don't need to know the full journey. Knowing what a refugee experience, is like in general for the majority of the population should be enough to understand what kind of trauma people may have experienced. But in the question, I think I saw, if you're talking about the circumstances that are happening in Afghanistan at the moment, there's nothing wrong with reaching out and checking in with your students and your families to see how they're coping. To say, look, we're well aware of the situation. It's, you know, it's traumatic. We don't know how to support you. We can't imagine what you're going through if you're not from that background. But how, you know, is there anything that we can do to support you or your family? You know, we're happy to find some agencies that might be able to support you. We're you know, happy to be there to support in any way we can. So just being upfront and honest that you may not have any solutions, but that as a school community, you're there for the student and their family and the whole community at whole, you know, that your heart does go out to them. That is really important, to acknowledge the heartache and pain that these families are going through.
Thank you for that, Janet. I did want to try to address a couple of the questions. One very interesting question that I don't think we got close to was kind of a disability space with a lot of the families. So the question from Teresa, or Therese, pardon the pronunciation, would any of you have experience working with families from refugee backgrounds that have children, sometimes multiple, with severe cognitive disabilities, and perhaps direct us to further information we can investigate?
I feel like I'm jumping in too much.
No, please do.
I do apologise. Well, I suppose Foundation House, because of the work that we do, our counsellor advocates, when working with parents and their children do have a disability, it normally comes up. For some cultures, it's quite a taboo and they don't want the rest of the community to know about it. So it's about supporting them in getting the right assessments, and if the child is at school, then if possible do the cognitive assessments through the school system. Otherwise through refugee health for younger children. And if they are, well, it depends what area you're in. I'm happy to send information, but if they're in a special school, whether it's an autism school or whether it's a disability developmental school, then making sure that when they're doing their assessments that you have interpreters to factor in previous education and previous trauma. Yeah, so some disability schools, developmental schools, won't put a label as per se. They might put the label just to get the funding, but explain to the parents that this may change due to the trauma that they've experienced. So, yeah.
Terrific. I'll just maybe take this one last question, and then perhaps that will be all the time we have for today. But Nicholas asks, and I think maybe this is more specifically addressed to Eva, but although many people, many of our panelists might have a view, is sometimes some teachers are isolated and don't have support from coordinators, senior teachers, and administration. What are some strategies or suggestions these teachers can implement?
Yeah, that happens sometimes, unfortunately. So it's really important that you become very active and seeking support. So if your immediate coordinators can't help you, maybe or work themselves, it's important to broaden your network on the same level with other teachers, or maybe across departments. For example, if you're an English teacher, talk with the maths teachers, how they are going, and to find people who can support you on a teacher level, and then go beyond your school borders to find groups of teachers or support systems like Foundation House, for example, who can support you in your individual work as well. And that will have an impact on your school, not only on yourself, but on other teachers and on the school level as well, because you will become more successful, you will look more after your own staff well-being, but also you will impact your class and your classrooms and the students, and that will be seen. So people will start asking, okay, how are you doing that? You will become the expert in the field, and that will impact everyone, and you will grow the network in your own school as well. So it's really important, if you don't get the support immediate from the people you would like to have the support from, you have to broaden your approach and see what are other avenues, other expert systems or groups I can draw from and get support from. Because if they can't give you the support you need, there is something happening for them as well, because coordinators are humans, so they might be they are not aware of it, or they can't do it for whatever reason. They are maybe burnout themselves. So it's really important to broaden your approach, besides obviously looking after yourself, that you're not burning out or being overwhelmed as well.
Thank you so much, Eva. May I add, this is all this project is about. We are looking at social support and how it impacts burnout, and we will have resources on how you can have better social support network in the online platform. I'm aware that we are running out of time, so I really want to thank the panelists for the great discussion, and we will continue the discussion in the online platform, so you can comment and contribute to the online platform. You will receive an email with the invitation and the recording of this session, so we could answer all the questions that has been unanswered in the online platform. And I would like to thank the Foundation House and also Teachers Foundation for their support of this webinar, and also the Networked Teacher project. And if you need to reach out to me if you have any question, feel free to contact me through my email address. Thank you so much. If there is anything else from the panel members, we just close the session. Thank you.
Thank you.